and my name is Mr. Jelly. And just as background, what you're going to need to know, I am 64 years old because this is a music thread, and this is not coming from some Pet Sounds worshipping George Harrison was the most creative Beatle kind of hipster. Okay, I don't know how many of you still like to listen to radio. I do. And unfortunately, I'm not going to give an advertisement for them, but I have to pay for my radio these days. Because you would have had to pay for radio for the last 40 years or so if you like listening to FM radio, for example. Because there's no such thing as rock and roll stations on FM radio. Now, this is about, and one of the rappers actually, calling AOR radio, apartheid-oriented radio. And yes, I'd agree with that entirely because they wouldn't play, for example, and I defy anybody to tell me when they ever heard this man. That's Ray Charles, by the way, since you knew I've never heard him on the radio, those stations you listen to. They never played this guy on those stations. They did play wonderful artists that he influenced, like Van Morrison, Joe Cocker, Eric Burden. But this guy, no, the man who invented soul music and was a part of the creative rock and roll. This guy, another giant, you never would have heard him either, by the way. That's James Brown, by the way, in action, in case you never heard of him. Sorry, never heard him. You would have heard him on AM radio, but not on FM classic rock radio. And then the man who I believe is the uncrowned king of rock and roll. They'll play Beatles versions of his songs on the radio, but they'll never play his stuff on the radio, except for maybe as a novelty kind of thing, but they never played him on the radio in their classic days. And part of it is they believe that rock and roll was invented in 1964, which of course it wasn't. Now, what got me interested in this stream particularly is a couple of weeks ago I was watching something, I flipped on a Grateful Dead movie, something called the Grateful Dead movie. And the Grateful Dead were attempting a version of Johnny B. Good, and I wanted to vomit. It didn't rock, it didn't roll, and this is why I mentioned my age before. I'm not some kid coming upon this. The hippies twirling around weren't dancing, as they say. They love to dance at Grateful Dead shows. That was nothing resembling dancing. It was the whitest possible audience you could possibly. And part of it is there's a collusion here, whether it's implied or not, between the media, the rock-oriented media, like Rolling Stone magazine, for example. I don't know when you could figure out Ray Charles being on the cover of the magazine. I don't remember ever happening in their prime when they were actually a music magazine. Or James Brown back when. Or this guy here who did make it to Monterey but never made it to Woodstock. Didn't live that long. Otis Redding. Okay, so Monterey, I give them a few props for having Otis there. Woodstock, though, was Sly and the Family. Same thing you hear on these stations, it's apartheid-oriented radio stations. Sly and the Family Stone, whose audience is largely white youth. Jimi Hendrix, whose audience spreads across the board, but who's targeted as a white youth audience. And a folkish singer who opened up the festival in the movie anyway, Richie Havens. That's what you would get. You would never get these acts. And by the way, the implication that they feel that rock and roll was invented in 1964, which is the way they act, and it's not rock and roll they play, it's rock music, which is the offshoot of it. Which means they also didn't play this guy on the radio. I think you all know who that is. I don't have to mention his name. No, they didn't play him either. Okay? That's the way it was. Now, part of it is also, I remember reading something about a late former critic of Rolling Stone, who was the editor of the music department for a long time, and he said publicly, "I don't connect with black music." This is the editor of a national magazine. He sure loved him some Jackson Browne. He loved Jackson Browne. Maybe you could figure out who it is by doing some research. I'm not going to mention his name, but he said publicly. Now, this is the man who's editing the record section of Rolling Stone magazine, the most influential music magazine of its time. And that also has some effect on the market and people reading the magazine. If you were interested in listening, and I'm not doing commercials here, listening to Ray Charles on the radio, or Otis Redding, or James Brown, or any of the people who came before them, you'd have to go to the ghetto of the radio, which is Saturday mornings the weekends when the ratings don't appear to count, mostly on public radio, by the way. Try to find this stuff on commercial radio. I just got so fed up of listening to the Doors every hour on the hour, and when they start saying they're playing a deep cut and they play something like Lady Madonna by the Beatles to them as a deep cut, it's a total wasteland. This is the wasteland that Newton Minow was talking about television in the early 60s. Radio, FM, rock, not rock and roll radio, over the last several decades, actually. And again, you'll hear now, Little Richard apparently had been very ill recently. Jerry Lee Lewis is up there, Chuck Berry's up there, and they'd be very interested to hear that the Beatles were the original. Beatles started rock and roll. And you know when you hear them, when they die, they'll play a little tribute on the radio to these people. They'll play Long Tall Sally, or they'll play a whole lot of Shaking Going On. They'll say, these were great artists. Yeah, well, how about playing them when they were still live, vital artists? That's my rant for today. Anyway, this is an open forum, and I would love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Don't forget to subscribe to Jolly Jelly Toys.